Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh Science Festival. Bears were once one of the biggest carnivores to roam Scotland's wild places. Join author Mandy Haggith and paleogeneticist Dr. Ross Barnett as they venture back in time through stories and skeletons to piece together the bear's legacy in Scotland, the loss of large mammals and what the future might bring. Mammals, Our Big Stories is a series of events exploring the relationship between humankind and our large mammals through storytelling and science, run in partnership between the Edinburgh Science Festival and the Scottish International Storytelling Festival. This event is free for you to enjoy thanks to our festival sponsors and supporters. Edinburgh Science is an educational charity. Do please consider making a donation through our website to support the work we do.
Mammals are big stories. Welcome to today's event. Our focus is on bears, Scottish bears, past and perhaps future. Future? Stick with us. We're going today first to join the storyteller for the Bear programme, Mandy Haggith, poet and novelist in the far northwest of Scotland.
I'm going to read a section from the novel called The Lyre Dancers, which is set in the Iron Age. And this section is from the perspective of a young woman called Sawyer, who's setting out into the woods to go foraging. And she's taking with her a young guy called Finn, who's just turned up on a boat that day. The path follows the stream up the glen, and we're soon among trees where the understory is thick with flowers and herbs. The feathery leaves of pignuts are thick here. Our pace drops as we keep stopping to dig them up. We have to stay close because there's only one basket. I like the way Finn holds his cupped hand out to empty it as I proffer the wicker container. As we repeat the action, it becomes more and more like a dance, an offering, acceptance. His gift, my thanks. He acts it up a bit, and it makes me laugh. I curtsy with exaggerated gratitude. I like the way he smiles, mostly on the left side of his face. We're concentrating on digging up the nuts, eating a few, of course, but largely they go in the basket. There's a trance-like state you get into while gathering. The plants you're after seem to multiply as your eye gets used to spotting them. Everything else in the world fades out of focus. There are just pignuts, the digging stick, and the basket. Then something makes me look up, and I see the bear. In its own foraging trance, munching and snuffling its way towards us. Finn is near enough for me to reach out and touch him on the sleeve. He turns, and I put my finger to my lips, then point to the bear. He freezes. His face has alarm written all over it, eyes wide, brows raised, mouth agape with the last intake of breath. Greetings to you, furry sister. I hope I sound strong, but friendly. There's no response, and I guess I'm too quiet. So I raise my voice. Big sister, hairy paws, I call out. Her ears twitch, and she lifts her snout. We're nutting too. I hope you don't mind us taking a share. She's listening to me, so I carry on, calling the first things to come into my head. I'm Sawyer. I'm not from these parts originally, but I'm staying with Danuta in the Broch. This is Finn. He came here on a boat with Mannigan today. He's not had fresh vegetables for ages. We're very pleased to meet you. I go on in this vein, and the bear seems to be paying attention. When I pause, she keeps her head up for a moment, then lowers her muzzle to the herbage again. I look round at Finn. He has closed his mouth, but his eyes are still wide with fear. I'm thrilled with all that this encounter signifies. But he has drawn his knife. No need for that, I whisper. She's just doing the same as us. We need to back off, he hisses. If we keep upwind of her, she'll know who we are. He's shaking his head. She'll not hurt us. How can you be sure? Sister Hairy Paws, I call. We're coming down this way. She lifts her head again. Her furry ears swivel, and I move out into the clearing, circling around so the wind will take our smell to her. Finn follows, tiptoeing. Off we go now. It was lovely to see you. We're almost directly upwind now, and she raises herself onto her hind paws, her mouth wide, breathing in our smell. I know she doesn't see too well, but she'll know everything about us from our scent. She slumps back down, turns her back on us, and saunters away. "Goodbye, sister," I say. Within moments, she's gone. Her big hairy rump has swung away, grass and bracken have closed behind her, and we look into a wooded space that hides her and who knows what other mysteries. She's gone. "How do you know it's she?" he says. "I don't know. She's small." He nods. "You're not scared?" "No. I'm digging again. My fingers will be muddy for days. I crunch on one nut and smile at him, then swallow. She's our spirit sibling. There's nothing to fear." "Who told you that?" "Mother, I guess. All I know is, never fear a bear unless you're between him and his food, or between a cub and its mother, or otherwise being rude." He's not looking at me. "I don't trust any bears," he grumbles. "Have you seen their jaws?" "They're more scared of us than we are of them." "I've seen bears that show no fear at all," he says. "Where?" "In the ice. Mannigan talks about them. They're white." "Yes, huge. They just want to eat you. I'm terrified of bears. Sorry." I'm surprised he's so candid about this fear. He's so different from Mannigan. "I'll keep you safe. Don't worry." We both laugh. I feel big and brave.
Mandy, that was great. Thank you very much. Just give us a little bit of background to that reading.
Okay, so that was a section from a novel called The Lyre Dancers, which is the third in a historical trilogy called The Stone Stories. And it's set mostly up in the northwest of Scotland, but it travels around as well. And it's in the Iron Age, so roughly 2,300 years ago. The passage that I read is obviously an encounter with bears, and we know that there were bears in the northwest of Scotland because we have their bones. There's not far from where I live in Elles, there's a cave system, a limestone cave system called the Inchnadanf Bone Caves, and there's even a cave there called Bear Cave because of the finding of bones there from brown bears. And it includes the most recent brown bear bones found in Scotland. So it seemed to be completely plausible to have encounters with bears in the story.
So it goes a bit beyond that in the story, because there's a strong sense of connection with the life of the bears, particularly amongst the women characters. So what's going on here? What's this whole thing about bears?
Well, in the course of my writing career, I've done a lot of research into the way in which people who live in countries where there are bears, how they interact with them and how historically they have interacted with them, and what the sort of indigenous cultural beliefs are about bears. And Scotland is completely abnormal as a country. We're the only country at our latitude where there aren't any bears anymore. So all the other countries in our latitude have bears, and the cultures tend to revere those bears. Indigenous cultures revere bears, partly, and yeah, for women it's a big deal because of the fact that in the winter, bears apparently bury themselves and take themselves underground and seem to die, and then in the spring the female bears are reborn with cubs. So they are they're very often in indigenous cultures in the Northern Hemisphere, bears are a symbol of rebirth and fertility, particularly powerfully for women.
Yeah, going together, the cycle of the seasons and nurture. So just set the scene. We're about to hear more, but we're moving a few centuries for this next reading. Give us a little bit of background to that.
Yeah, okay, so the next one is from a book called The Last Bear, which was actually my first novel, and it explores why and how bears became extinct in Scotland. And nobody knows exactly when the last bear was. And unlike the wolf, there aren't really even sort of folk stories about the last bear. And so I pestered animal historians, including those at the National Museum of Scotland, as to when might be the plausible date for a story about the last bear. And it turned out that 1,000 years ago is a plausible last bear date. And it's a very significant time, because that's also the time at which the pagan pre-Christian culture in Scotland was squeezed out, because that's in 999 AD, Sigurd the Stout, who was the Jarl of Orkney, who answered to the King of Norway, and who had political control over Caithness and Sutherland. That was when he was converted to Christianity. And of course, the Scots further south in Scotland were a Christian culture by then as well. And really, that's the point when the pagan pre-Christian culture that might have revered bears just as indigenous cultures did, that was when that culture kind of really evaporated. And we can see that's the case across many other cultures, where change of religious belief can often lead to a loss of reverence for the animals, which then are no longer protected. And we think that's probably what happened to the bears in Scotland.
Okay, so let's hear it and go back to lovely accent.
Okay.
She's becoming drowsy. Days are short and nights are long. It's time to hibernate, to put away the world and its smells, the feeling of wet fur, the numbness of cold paws slipping on rocks. The salmon have stopped running, so days at the river are futile. Most of the berries are over, only the most difficult to reach remain, and too many of those are riddled with maggots. Mice have stolen all the nuts and acorns with kernels in them. Fungi are melting in the frost. The urge to sleep is strong. It's been a good year, a summer of plenty. She's caught lots of fat fish, though it's taken more time than it used to. There are changes at the forest edges. The villagers are cutting down trees with a great noise of metal on wood. They build smoking mounds which stink of evil. She fears them. She is lonely. She has no mate. She wanders the forest seeking her kind, hoping to catch the scent of a bear between the trees. But there's nothing. The most promising trails lead only to badgers. Occasionally there is the stench of a wolf pack roaming, though they come here rarely now. One day she chased a lynx from its roe deer kill, but never a bear. She has no young, only a longing for a cub to feed at her belly, warm in her den. Instead, her sleep will be solitary, and no cubs will be born in the dark this winter. It'll be like all her other winters, empty. Yet she must sleep. Dreams call her. She finds herself at the edge of the trees. Water stretches away and the forest scents are washed through with salt and seaweed. Fresh water gurgles nearby where a loch spills down a gully into a muddle of bladderwrack. It's slippery, soft and slimy, and as 4 wet paws squelch through it, the stench is intoxicating. Over the channel and up the rocky shore she scrambles. It's exposed here, open in all directions. The wind is cold. This is a strange place. The rocks are steep and wobble with a hollow rocking sound. A seal slithers off a skerry and bobs offshore. Then it slaps a flipper, splash, and is gone. The water stretches out on the right, far away out into nothingness, away to an empty nowhere that smells of winter and tastes of fish. The wind is making the trees dance. She goes down a wee bit more around a big rock, the sea now out of sight, and into the dark wood's heart. Here is her winter hiding place, under a giant rock where a rowan tree grows. Its roots pierce the stone, giving it a toehold so strong that it can lean out over the sheer cliff, festooned with leaf, proffering berries to the birds as if it's ready to fly off with them from its precarious perch. Every year it scatters leaves and twigs at the entrance to the den, just where she needs them. It's all bare of leaves now, a silver skeleton keeping watch. Sniffing around the edge of her hole, she peers in. It's a small cave formed from a scatter of huge boulders. It looks quiet, only a few bits of hair from the summer residents, the mice, who'll soon scuttle off once they see she's back. An otter has been visiting. Smelling its cat musk, she leaves her own scent on her entrance stone, so whoever needs to know she's home will know. She scratches the ground and drags some leaves and sticks from the entrance into the den, along with grass and moss. They're not dry, but they'll do fine to lie on. There are still some old leaves in here from last year. In her sleepy hole she nestles. It's dark and quiet inside the earth. Her breath slows. She's back in the womb. Although she cannot be a mother, she can at least give birth to herself every year. Every spring become a reborn bear, a cub. Now she feels very old, very tired. Her eyes close. It's time to doze, cradled in the depths of the long night, to return to the time before birth, to dream with the shadows and rummage with the tree roots into the heart of the mother bear.
So we'd like to widen the conversation now and invite in Ross Barnett. He's in Inverness today. Now, Ross is a paleontologist and he is an absolute expert, a whiz on deciphering ancient DNA and coming up with all sorts of interesting information about the past, but also with implications for the future. So Ross, we're delighted to have you in the conversation today. And I know, first of all, you're going to talk a little bit about your work, and then Mandy is going to respond to that.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. And I should just clarify as well that one of the species I have worked on is bears, in particular brown bears and polar bears, and including brown bears from the UK. So some of the last bears that were found in Britain, we've looked at their genetics as well and found some pretty cool things out about them. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in bears. I think they're a keystone species, as I'm sure Mandy will agree with me. And I think an interesting point, kind of coming from what she said about the UK being unusual geographically in terms of not having bears. I think it's also interesting to note out that it's unusual kind of chronologically that we don't have bears as an active part of our culture. I mean, the human bear interactions go back a very, very long way. We have kind of evidence from cave sites in places like Belgium, which show kind of ceremonial use of bear bones, like covered in iron oxides, red ochre, those kind of things, which show that, going back very, very far in European culture, bears had an important place.
No, they're kind of sibling animals in a way, aren't they? I remember seeing a First Nation North American having skinned a bear, and with the fur off, the bodies are incredibly like our bodies, actually, and they like all the same food that we like. And so, yeah.
Yeah, personality-wise, there's a lot of parallels as well. I mean, they can be gentle, but they can also be quite aggressive and vicious as well. And I think it's another interesting point. What makes it really kind of difficult, I think, to talk about bears and when they went extinct, as you said before, we're not entirely sure when they disappeared from Britain, is that because they've been so important in kind of cultural uses, that a lot of the actual skeletal elements of bones that we have in the UK have come from phalanges, so finger bones or other kind of extremities that could have come from bear skins, or we have skulls which could have been imported as trophies, and we also have, a very active sort of transport network for bears, particularly in kind of post-Roman times, where are these bear remains that we find in kind of settled villages and towns and even cities of the kind of post-Roman period, are they bears that have come from the local countryside, or are they bears that have been imported from Germania or Gaul or other places for cultural uses in gladiator fights and things like that. So it makes it really difficult, I think, to really get a good answer to when they disappear. But as Mandy says, I think that about 1,000 years ago is as good a guess as any we're going to get.
Yeah, no, it's always strikes me as a real shame. It's really fascinating in your book, your brilliant book, The Missing Lynx, how many of the animals that humans have wiped out, we've done so because they have periods of their lives sometimes where they're really easy targets, and bears, because of the fact that they hibernate, if you know their den site, then they're really easy to wipe out, actually, because you can go and clobber them while they're sleeping. And as you know, a lot of Russian bear hunting still goes on in that way, that they're still hunted while they're hibernating. And yet in indigenous cultures, I think it's really interesting that that in some places still in North America, the denning sites are very sacred places. And part of that kind of reverence for the bear is actually to leave it sleeping peacefully over the winter and protect the kind of the hibernation sites. And I wonder whether Inchinna Dam Farm, our cave system in Assen in times past, would actually have been a very sacred place, actually, because potentially bears would have been sleeping there in the winter.
That's fascinating. It's kind of native conservationism at work. I mean, it shows how people that live with these animals have reverence for them, but also use them as a resource. How well they integrate that into their way of life, and have a real respect and a real understanding of what is exploitation and what isn't, which I think is something we can all really learn from.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's interesting. I mean, if you were to discuss today with most people whether they thought that spearing sleeping animals and butchering while they hibernated was okay, they might have a problem with that. Would kind of go against the kind of modern hunting ethos. But when you look at it from a different perspective, it's actually a much more ecologically sound way of doing it, probably. And I think we're talking about brown bears here, but there's also evidence, again, from the past, that our other kind of European bear species, the cave bear, which has been long gone, that humans were doing exactly the same thing with that species. They were hunting it while it was hibernating, and using it, as a food resource in times of stress in the winter when they were asleep underground.
Yeah, sure. And obviously brilliant fur for keeping warm and yeah, using every bit of the body, which
and for sure, and we definitely know that they were doing that. I mean, bearskin is still used today as sort of ceremonial guard outfits and the rest of it. And I think there's also, I read somewhere recently that there's actually a preserved bear cloak from a site in, let me just look at the notes, White Horse Hill down south. Apparently it's been preserved in kind of an anoxic environment. So we have an actual bear skin from I think it's Iron Age or slightly earlier. So these things have been used for a very long time.
Yeah, for sure. I remember learning from one bear expert that a really interesting insight that fear and love are very close together, and that reverence is a mixture of fear and love, and that we need to kind of nurture both of those to have a kind of healthy kind of respect and for bears, but also a kind of loving reverence for them. And if we could redevelop that, then we might end up being able potentially to bring them back, because like you said at the beginning, they're keystone species, and I think that our ecologies, our ecosystems really miss bears. I think one of the most telling things about the presence of bear in our landscape is that their primary ecological function, if you like, if animals have ecological functions, but really important ecological role that bears play is to spread seeds. And because they roam widely, and because they love eating everything fruity and nutty, and lots of those fruit and nut seeds then pass through their bodies with very copious amounts of good fertilizer. And that actually, therefore, after the Iron Age, after the Ice Age, when we look at the spread of oaks across Britain, it's very likely actually that a major vector of those oaks across the landscape was bears. And so if we want lots of regeneration of mixed rich woodland, that actually bears would be very, very helpful in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, their ecological roles are critical. And I think it also ties into what you're saying about the idea of reverence being fear and love. I mean, that's obviously true from a human point of view, but when we think about wolves and kind of landscapes of fear and the effect that predators and a large omnivore like the brown bear could have on the landscape, that's clearly missing. That ecological role is not being fulfilled, particularly in Scotland, where we have no native carnivores larger than a badger. So I think the kind of idea of rewilding of bears, I mean, it makes sense probably to you and me in a limited sense for Britain, maybe not so much for the general public, but I mean, there's still that lack of recognition of the brown bear as a native to Scotland. And rewilding has its own issues. And as far as I'm aware, there's not been any attempts to reintroduce brown bears in Europe. There's been attempts to kind of seed small populations where there already are bears with extra numbers. But I don't know, Mandy, maybe you have more information on that than I have.
I think the Pyrenean situation, were they not lost completely and then reintroduced to the Pyrenees?
I think there's always been like very, very low numbers, but I think there's always been a few, and particularly the Pyrenees and the Apennines are the places that I know that they have tried to sort of reseed the population where it's got to critically low levels with kind of mixed success. So yeah, in those kind of situations, I think the bears are always there just at very, very low numbers, and they've tried to kind of bolster those numbers with bears from outside. But again, I mean, it just shows how tricky this kind of work is. We have so many variables to balance in terms of the actual logistics of the work, but also public perceptions of what it is as well.
Yeah, sure. And the huge amount will need to change from the point of view of land management. Farming practices would need to adjust to the presence of bears in the landscape, because there's no doubt about the fact that they would have a big impact. But I think it is, I mean, it's not like we would be starting from scratch, and there's loads of countries in Europe that live with European brown bears in large numbers, very large numbers in some countries, and close to
close to populated industrial regions. I mean, it is possible to live harmoniously with bears when the will is there, and that's the critical issue, I think.
So that's right.
Ross and Mandy, we've got listeners and viewers joining in here and sending in questions to this great conversation. And the two things that are focusing interest. So first of all, people are sort of asking, why did the bears become extinct? Were they just hunted out? Were there other factors? What led to that extinction? Ross, have you got a comment on that? Or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what's interesting, and Mandy touched on this earlier, is that the very last secure date we have for brown bear in the whole of the UK comes from Kinsey Cave in Yorkshire, and it's from a date that was taken on I think a bit of bone, a vertebral bone, so a backbone of a bear, which suggests it wasn't from a cultural usage. It wasn't from a bear skin or a trophy or something like that, and probably was from a wild living bear in Yorkshire at around about the 5th, 6th century AD. And Kinsey Cave is interesting as well because it's the last place we find dated evidence for lynx, Eurasian lynx in the UK too, which suggests that the area around Kinsey Cave in Yorkshire was until fairly late, until at least the 6th or 7th century, quite wild and wooded. And I think these, as kind of around about the last dates, maybe 8th, 9th century, 10th century, would make sense, particularly as Mandy says, because we have massive kind of societal change at this point in time. We have, the complete kind of Christianization of the whole of the island, and we lose the kind of pagan connection that we would have had to brown bears as part of the environment. I'm sure that probably had a big effect. Also, inevitably, habitat change through loss of woodland and change in landscape usage, increase in farming, increase of population centers and things like that. And so inevitably, I think it's down to human factors. There's no kind of environmental or there's no kind of climate explanation for the loss of brown bears in Britain. It's purely a human factor.
So Mandy, I mean, it sounds like you've got the period pretty right in The Last Bear with both these Norse and these Christian influences. And reading The Last Bear, which is a great read, that that sense of the woodland being pushed back and overexploited comes through very strongly in that book, you know, as if the bears and the wood somehow belong together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a food source, woodland is by far the preferred environment for a bear, because bears are omnivorous, and you know, so they want in the autumn in particular, they really relish the amount of rich food that a woodland can produce in order for them to fatten up for hibernation. So, I mean, they would also survive. I mean, there are bears that live outside of woodlands in kind of tundra environments, and so in northern Russia, the bears that live north of the tree line are much more carnivorous, and so they would take much more in the way of deer and so forth. But also deer, of course, are naturally woodland animals as well. So, yeah, so woodlands would have been a preferred habitat for the bears, for sure. And so pressure on that, but also pressure, like we said, on the loss of the sacred nature of the denning sites, the winter hibernation sites, and pressure for those would have been would have caused their loss as well.
It's interesting, there's potentially a little trace of all that in some of the Scottish Arthur lore, about the cycle of the seasons and Arthur and the bear star and all that stuff is quite interesting. But the other thing, and this I think is...
And Arthur, of course, means bear.
Means bear.
Yeah, the actual roots of the words are the same. So,
yeah.
Ursus arctus is the scientific name for the brown bear, and that Arctus and Arthur are linked. Yeah.
People forget how old the Arthur traditions are in the Scottish landscape. So the other questions that are coming in, and really for both of you, are very focused on this: is it practical to rewild and reintroduce the bear? Now, we've got the beavers. The debate is on regarding wolves and the lynx, I would suggest. So should we be adding bears to this list? So I don't know what order you want to take this in. Mandy, do you want to start? And then we'll come to Ross. Is this, we should reintroduce the bear, but what are the practical challenges?
Yeah, well, I think they definitely should be on the agenda and being discussed. It amazes me that people are willing to consider wolves before bears. Quite frankly, I think that's extraordinary. The range of a wolf pack is far bigger than the range of that a bear would need. Bears are omnivorous, whereas wolves are wholly carnivorous. And there would be big challenges. There's no doubt about the fact that if you look at countries which have farming systems similar to ours, like Norway, for example, then there are livestock bear conflicts. I mean, bears will try to take sheep. They're less likely to tackle cattle, but sheep certainly would be at risk given the kind of way that we just let sheep roam unprotected on the hills. Whereas in other countries where there are large bear numbers, and it's really interesting to compare Norway with Sweden. So just over the border in Sweden, there are 3,000 bears. And there are strong incentives from the government to farmers to protect their sheep, and they manage sheep in a very different way. They house them much more. They protect them in field systems much more. They have lots of dogs, and dogs are absolutely fundamental to living with bears. And there are lots of breeds of dogs across Europe that we would need to have, and certainly in most European countries, farmers are given subsidies to feed dogs and train dogs and have specialist dogs that are able to frighten bears off. And bears they're very frightened creatures. They're scared of us, probably much more scared of us than we are of them. And there really are incredibly few losses. Certainly the risk to humans is pretty negligible in Europe. Sheep are far more dangerous. Sheep kill more people in Europe than bears and wolves put together. So yeah, I think, but we would definitely need to look at ways to provide incentives to farmers to be able to protect their animals from any carnivores that we introduce, whether that's lynx or wolves or bears.
Ross.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mandy. I think that the issue is not risk to humans. The issue is risk to livestock and how we manage that. I think it's great that bears are on the agenda. I think that, as you said before, that there's other species that kind of come first in terms of reintroduction potential. And I would say at top of the list, although I'm obviously massively biased, would be the lynx as a kind of test run, because lynx are, completely not a problem for humans. There's no evidence in any records of humans ever being kind of killed by lynx at all. I mean, they're just not capable of it. They do take sheep, but there's places where that's successfully managed. And if we look at those as guides to how to do it, then I think having lynx back would be the ideal kind of next species to look at after beaver, if we're serious about reintroduction of extinct species in this country. And then once lynx are successful, which I'm sure and hopeful that they will be, then we need to look at bringing in the bigger guns, the wolves and the bear, and look at the problems and pitfalls that have happened along the way to lynx reintroduction, and use that knowledge to implement successful reintroduction for wolves and bears.
I think that's right. And what we really need is proper in-depth studies. At the moment, there has been some good feasibility study work on lynx, particularly David Hetherington's work's really important on that. We need the equivalent on wolves and bears to really understand what the ecological impacts are, where there might be at the current impoverished state of our ecosystems, where there might be feasible places for other carnivores to live. But also we need a load more work to consult with people who are land managers in terms of how to actually shift to a point where they would have the kind of husbandry options in an economically viable way to enable them to do this. And because there's no doubt about the fact that the benefits from the non-farming public would be enormous, in the sense of there's huge popularity in the idea of rewilding, and loads of tourism income potentially from wilder landscapes that include carnivores. But that economic benefit needs to then be managed so that the people who are trying to make livings off the land are getting a share of that in order to be able to use it. Yeah.
And I think that's something that really kind of almost gets lost in the conversations that are had, that a lot of the kind of press and media around it discusses the dangers and the problems and the issues, and doesn't discuss the massive benefits that having these animals back would have, not just in ecological terms in restoring their kind of ecological functions, but also in terms of ecotourism, in terms of the numbers that would bring into our rural economies. And I think apart from hopefully having the lynx as a test case scenario, we can look at definitely the issues like with the white-tailed eagle, which has done a similar thing, bringing back a kind of apex carnivore, but in the bird world, and that's been done really successfully in Scotland. And the numbers of kind of ecotourists that's brought in, bird watchers, boosts the local economy in places like Mull, where they're now found and can regularly be seen. And so I think that there needs to be almost a kind of push of the conversation towards the benefits and away from the risks and other factors which can be controlled for. And we know other countries where they manage those risks very successfully. And if we can emphasize the benefits, then that'll hopefully make the conversation a much more nuanced one.
So this is really about coexistence, isn't it? And that's where the science and the storytelling come together to help that sense of cultural change and moving forward for our ecology and also our society. So that may be a good minute just to cue in, because we're going to hear another little bit of storytelling, which is very much about the struggle now and the vision for the future. But thank you very much for that interchange and for responding to these questions that have come in to both Ross and Mandy. But Mandy, I think we're going to seg into another little bit of story now.
This section is from a novel called Bear Witness, which is a kind of thought experiment about how bears might be reintroduced to Scotland in the future. In this section, there are two bears in question, and they're called Hansel and Gretel. The site is up a forestry road. We lurch our way up the ruts into the pine plantation. Inside the forest, the dusk is deeper. A mile from the road, we stop at a fork in the track. Pivy dives into the back of the van. Hansel is showing the first signs of movement. Gretel is slumped in deep sleep, mouth slightly open, head tilted on one side. Pivy chews her fingernails as Tanker and I ease Hansel's crate towards the tailgate. It's tough going, and I wish I was stronger. Hansel isn't a particularly big bear, but shifting 150 kilograms of crated animals is no easy business. Tanker works calmly and efficiently, setting up a ramp, giving me instructions. It works surprisingly well, his system, taking full advantage of gravity. It's evident that this is by no means the first time he's done this operation. With the crate on the ground, Pivy prizes open the grille, then we back off with the van and watch from the vehicle as Hansel makes his first tentative steps in the wild for 18 months. The bear sniffs the warm Scottish air. I sniff too. The scent of honeysuckle and round blossom is rich gold and sweet like honey. My elation is pure fire. "Welcome to Scotland, Hansel," I say. Tears prickle my eyes. I can't quite believe what we've done. The bear stretches languorously and looks around, eyeing the vehicle. Then, with none of the slow wake-up I witnessed in Norway, he turns his back, steps purposefully into the thick undergrowth of willow and bracken, and is gone. There's no time to relish his furry form. We're left with just an empty crate and the knowledge he's free in the woods. Tanker and I look at each other. He raises an eyebrow and smiles. There's no need for words. I lean against the van. Hansel has snuffled off into his new home, and now only the crate suggests he was anything other than a fantasy. I wonder if the drug has overtaken him again and he's lying somewhere nearby, snoozing, to wake later, looked down on by a curious owl or squirrel. I hope he'll be all right, and will steer clear of the humans at Cannock down the road, or the noisy visitors who throng the Dogfalls car park and walk the loop tracks through this last fragment of Caledonian pine forest. Will he make his way out of the forest, onto the scrub and moorland above the tree line, and meet the many deer up there? I wonder when he'll make his first kill, whether he'll be seen, who will be the first to notice his scat, spoor, or scrapes on trees, whose sightings will be given credibility, what Scotland's reaction will be.
So friends, a warm thank you to our contributors today, to Ross Barnett and to Mandy Haggith. Check out their great books, The Missing Lynx, and also The Last Bear and Mandy's other novels. But that's us for today. Mammals are big stories. Don't miss out on the rest of the programmes when we'll be looking at elephants and at whales. The stories are getting